Wars have shaped the course of human civilization. They have destroyed empires, redrawn borders, and taken tens of millions of lives. But some wars were not just conflicts, they were catastrophes on a scale so massive, so devastating, that the world was never the same again. Today, we are counting down the top 5 most dangerous wars in history. These are not just battles, these are events that shook the entire planet. Empires that had stood for centuries crumbled overnight. Populations that had built cultures, arts, and sciences over thousands of years were wiped off the face of the earth in just a few brutal years. So sit back, because what you are about to hear is going to change how you see human history forever. Let's get into it. We start our list with the Napoleonic Wars, a series of major conflicts that swept across Europe in the early 19th century. At the center of it all was one man. Napoleon Bonaparte, the military genius who rose from being a simple soldier to become the Emperor of France. Napoleon had one ambition: to dominate all of Europe. And for a while, he nearly succeeded. These wars involved almost every major power in Europe: Britain, Russia, Austria, Prussia, Spain, and many others. The fighting stretched from the freezing cold of Russia to the burning deserts of Egypt. Entire armies were wiped out. Cities were burned to the ground. Nations were shattered and rebuilt. Families were torn apart. Farmers became soldiers overnight, sent to die on battlefields hundreds of miles from home, fighting for causes they barely understood. What made Napoleon so dangerous was not just his army, it was his mind. He was a tactical genius. He could look at a battlefield and see opportunities that no other general could see. He won victory after victory against armies that outnumbered him. He defeated the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians, and dominated most of continental Europe at his peak. At one point, he controlled more of Europe than any ruler since the Roman Empire. But his greatest mistake came in 1812, when he decided to invade Russia. He marched into Russia with over 600,000 soldiers, one of the largest armies ever assembled in history. But the Russians refused to fight him directly. Instead, they retreated deeper and deeper into their own territory, burning everything behind them, so Napoleon's army had nothing to eat, nowhere to shelter. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found the city in flames. The Russians had set their own capital on fire rather than let him have it. With winter coming and his supply lines completely broken, Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. Of the 600,000 soldiers who had marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it back alive. The rest died from battle, starvation, frostbite, and disease. It was one of the greatest military disasters in history. The total death toll of the Napoleonic Wars is estimated to be between 3.5 million and 6 million people. When you include civilian deaths from disease, starvation, and displacement, the numbers climb even higher. Some historians put the total figure close to 7 million. For a world with a much smaller population than today, this was absolutely devastating. Entire regions of Europe were left depopulated. Villages that had existed for centuries simply ceased to exist. The wars finally ended at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, where Napoleon was defeated for the last time. He was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he died 6 years later. But the legacy of the Napoleonic Wars lasted for decades. They completely redrew the map of Europe and gave birth to the concept of modern nationalism. This war was dangerous not just because of the deaths it caused, but because of the ideas it spread, ideas about nationhood, about revolution, about power, ideas that would eventually lead to even deadlier conflicts in the century that followed. Coming in at number 4 is one of the most brutal and terrifying campaigns in all of human history, the Mongol Conquests. Led first by Genghis Khan and then by his descendants, the Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. And they built it entirely through war, destruction, and absolute terror. Genghis Khan was born into poverty and hardship. As a child, his father was poisoned by rivals, and his family was abandoned by their own tribe. He was even captured and enslaved as a young man. But he survived. He grew stronger. And through sheer will and military brilliance, he united the fractured Mongol tribes into the most fearsome fighting force the world had ever seen. The Mongols swept across Central Asia, China, Persia, Russia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. They were not just conquerors, they were destroyers. Their strategy was simple and terrifying: surrender and be spared, or resist and be annihilated. When a city refused to surrender, they would massacre every single person inside. They would line up the inhabitants, men, women, children, elderly, and kill them all. Then they would burn the city to ash so that nothing remained. This was not cruelty for the sake of cruelty, it was calculated terror. They wanted every other city within 1,000 miles to hear what had happened and surrender without a fight. The city of Baghdad, which was the center of the Islamic Golden Age and one of the most advanced cities in the world at that time, was completely destroyed in 1258. Baghdad was a city of over 1 million people, filled with libraries, universities, hospitals, and scholars from all over the world. The Mongols killed the caliph, burned the libraries, and turned the streets red with blood. Historians say the waters of the Tigris River ran black with ink from the destroyed books and red with blood from the massacred people. Centuries of human knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, was lost in a matter of days. It was the end of an entire era of human progress, and the Islamic world never fully recovered from it. The total death toll from the Mongol conquests is staggering. Estimates range from 40 million to 60 million people. In some regions of Central Asia and Persia, up to 90% of the population was killed. The world's population actually decreased during this period because of the scale of the destruction. Entire cities became ghost towns. Farmland turned back into desert because there was nobody left to tend to it. The Mongol conquests did not just kill people, they killed entire cultures, languages, and ways of life that can never be recovered. That is why this conflict firmly earns its place on this list. Number 3 is the First World War, the war that was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It wasn't. But it was certainly one of the deadliest and most horrifying conflicts the world had ever seen at that point in history. World War I began in 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo. What started as a regional dispute quickly triggered a chain reaction of alliances and obligations that pulled every major power in Europe into the conflict within just a few weeks. What nobody expected was how long it would last or how many people it would kill. What made World War I so uniquely horrifying was the brutal mismatch between old military tactics and terrifyingly new weapons. Military commanders were still using 19th-century battlefield strategies, marching large formations of soldiers forward in organized lines, but they were facing machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, and barbed wire. The result was slaughter on an almost unimaginable scale. Soldiers would climb out of their trenches and walk into open ground, only to be cut down by machine gun fire within seconds. Commanders would order attack after attack, day after day, week after week, and gain nothing except more casualties. The trenches themselves became living nightmares. Soldiers spent months sitting in narrow ditches filled with mud, rats, and the bodies of their dead comrades. They ate cold rations, slept in the rain, and lived under the constant threat of artillery bombardment. A condition called shell shock, what we now call PTSD, destroyed the minds of hundreds of thousands of men who survived the battles but could never escape what they had seen. The Battle of the Somme, which began in July 1916, saw over 57,000 British soldiers killed or wounded on the very first day alone. By the end of the battle, over 1 million soldiers from all sides had become casualties, and the front line had barely moved. This was the reality of World War I. Millions dying for inches of mud. By the time the war ended in November 1918, approximately 20 million people had been killed, soldiers and civilians alike. Another 21 million were wounded, many of them permanently disabled. And if that wasn't enough, the movement of soldiers across the globe during and after the war helped spread the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, which went on to kill between 50 and 100 million people worldwide in just 2 years. World War I also completely destroyed 4 of the world's most powerful empires, the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German empires, all within a few years of each other. The way the war ended, with the deeply humiliating Treaty of Versailles imposed on Germany, planted seeds of anger and resentment that would grow into something even more monstrous just 2 decades later. And that brings us to number 2, the single deadliest conventional war in all of recorded human history. World War II. If World War I was a catastrophe, World War II was an extinction-level event for entire populations. It involved more countries, more soldiers, more weapons of mass destruction, and caused more death and suffering than any other armed conflict before or since. The war began on September 1, 1939, when Nazi Germany, under the command of Adolf Hitler, launched a massive invasion of Poland. Britain and France, who had guaranteed Poland's independence, declared war on Germany 2 days later. What followed was 6 years of the most savage, widespread, and technologically advanced warfare the world had ever witnessed. Germany's military machine was terrifyingly efficient in the early years. Using a strategy called Blitzkrieg, lightning war, they combined tanks, aircraft, and fast-moving infantry to overwhelm their enemies before they could react. France, which had resisted Germany for 4 years in World War I, fell in just 6 weeks. Country after country collapsed under the German advance. By 1941, Germany controlled most of continental Europe and seemed unstoppable. But then Hitler made the same catastrophic mistake as Napoleon: he invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, was the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. The fighting on the Eastern Front was unlike anything else in the war. It was total, merciless, and savage on both sides. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million people during World War II, a number so large it is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Nearly 1 in 7 Soviet citizens died during those 4 years. Entire cities like Leningrad were besieged for nearly 900 days, with civilians dying of starvation by the hundreds of thousands. The city of Stalingrad became the site of one of the most brutal urban battles in history, fought street by street, building by building, floor by floor, room by room, for months on end. In the Pacific, Japan was waging its own war of conquest across China and Southeast Asia, committing horrific atrocities against civilian populations. The Nanjing massacre alone saw an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians murdered by Japanese soldiers in just 6 weeks. Millions more died across the region from battle, forced labor, and deliberate starvation. And then there was the Holocaust, the systematic, industrialized genocide carried out by Nazi Germany against the Jewish people and other groups they deemed inferior. 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were murdered in death camps, shooting squads, and gas chambers. Millions more, Roma people, disabled individuals, political prisoners, Soviet POWs, were also systematically exterminated. The Holocaust was not a side effect of the war. It was a deliberate, carefully organized program of mass murder, carried out with bureaucratic efficiency while the war raged around it. It remains the most documented case of genocide in human history. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 when Germany surrendered after Soviet forces stormed Berlin. But the war in the Pacific continued. Japan refused to surrender even as American forces island-hopped closer to the Japanese mainland. Then, in August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima was essentially erased from the map in a single instant. Over 70,000 people died immediately from the blast and heat. Tens of thousands more died in the weeks and months that followed from radiation sickness. Japan surrendered days later, ending the deadliest war in human history. By the final count, between 70 and 85 million people had been killed in World War II. Roughly 3% of the entire world's population at the time. The physical destruction was almost incomprehensible. Entire cities across Europe and Asia lay in rubble. Economies had collapsed. Tens of millions of people had been displaced from their homes. The world that existed before 1939 was completely gone. Out of the ruins came a new world order, the United Nations, the Cold War, the nuclear age, and the beginning of the end of European colonial empires. World War II did not just change history. It created the modern world as we know it today. But our number one spot goes to a conflict that most people in the Western world have never even heard of. And that fact alone should shock you. Because what happened in China between 1850 and 1864 may well be the single deadliest internal conflict in all of human history, and it receives almost no attention in mainstream history education outside of China. This was the Taiping Rebellion. And it was unlike anything that had ever happened before or has happened since. It began with one man, a man named Hong Xiuquan. Hong was a Chinese scholar who had failed the imperial civil service examinations multiple times. After his final failure, he suffered a mental breakdown and experienced a series of vivid, powerful visions. When he later encountered Christian missionary literature, he became convinced that his visions had revealed something extraordinary. That he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent by God to purify China and establish a new holy kingdom on earth. He called it the heavenly kingdom of great peace, the Taiping Tianhua. What is truly astonishing is how many people believed him. China at this time was in deep crisis. The Qing dynasty was corrupt, weak, and deeply unpopular. Millions of ordinary Chinese people, peasants, farmers, the desperately poor, were suffering under heavy taxes and economic collapse made worse by the recent humiliation of the Opium Wars with Britain. When Hong Xiuquan offered them not just a new political order but a spiritual revolution, a divine mission, a reason to fight and die for something greater than themselves, they responded in staggering numbers. Within a few years, his movement had grown from a small religious group into an army of millions. The Taiping forces were not a ragged mob. They were organized, disciplined, and fanatically devoted to their cause. They swept across southern China, capturing city after city. In 1853, they captured the major city of Nanjing and made it the capital of their heavenly kingdom. For over a decade, they controlled a massive territory in southern China with a population of tens of millions of people. They had their own government, their own military, their own laws, and their own radical social policies, including the abolition of foot binding for women, the banning of opium, and the redistribution of land to the poor. But war was inevitable. The Qing imperial government could not allow this rebellion to stand. What followed was 14 years of some of the most brutal and relentless warfare China had ever seen. Both sides fought with complete ruthlessness. When the Qing forces captured a city held by the Taiping, they massacred the inhabitants. When the Taiping forces captured a Qing-held city, they did the same. There was no mercy. There were no rules. There was only killing. The scale of the destruction was staggering. Province after province was turned into a wasteland. Farmland that had fed millions of people was burned or abandoned. Irrigation systems that had taken generations to build were destroyed. With the farmland gone, famine swept across the region. With millions of people crowded together in refugee camps and besieged cities, disease followed. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all exploded through the population with devastating efficiency. City after city was reduced to rubble. Yangzhou, Hangzhou, Suzhou, great cities that had existed and thrived for 1,000 years, were devastated beyond recognition. The province of Jiangsu alone, one of the most densely populated and prosperous regions in China, lost an estimated half of its entire population during the rebellion. That is not a rounding error. That is not an exaggeration. Half of the people who lived there when the rebellion began were dead by the time it ended. The rebellion was finally crushed in 1864, when Qing forces, supported by Western-trained troops under commanders like Frederick Townsend Ward and later Charles Gordon, a British officer who became famous as Chinese Gordon, surrounded the Taiping capital of Nanjing. Hong Xiuquan himself died just before the final fall of the city, reportedly from illness or possibly by suicide. With their divine leader gone, the heavenly kingdom collapsed. Nanjing was stormed, and in the final massacre, tens of thousands more were killed. But the killing did not stop there. Scattered Taiping forces continued to resist for years afterward, and the Qing government hunted them down with ruthless efficiency. The final death toll of the Taiping Rebellion is one of the most debated numbers in historical scholarship. Conservative estimates put it at 20 to 30 million people. More recent research, taking into account all deaths from battle, massacre, famine, and disease across the entire affected region, puts the figure between 50 and 70 million. Some historians argue the true toll may be even higher. To put that in perspective, the Taiping Rebellion may have killed more people than World War I. In just 14 years. In a single country. And yet most people in the Western world have never heard of it. The Taiping Rebellion earns the #1 spot on this list not only because of the sheer scale of death and destruction it caused, but also because of what it represents. A reminder that the most catastrophic events in human history are not always the ones that get written into the textbooks we read in school. History is vast, and suffering does not care which continent it happens on. Wars have shaped the course of human civilization. They have destroyed empires, redrawn borders, and taken tens of millions of lives. But some wars were not just conflicts, they were catastrophes on a scale so massive, so devastating, that the world was never the same again. Today, we are counting down the top 5 most dangerous wars in history. These are not just battles, these are events that shook the entire planet. Empires that had stood for centuries crumbled overnight. Populations that had built cultures, arts, and sciences over thousands of years were wiped off the face of the earth in just a few brutal years. So sit back, because what you are about to hear is going to change how you see human history forever. Let's get into it.